In these tumultuous times of a global pandemic, as a nation, we are also in the midst of a reckoning with the long and terrorizing legacy of white supremacy. And in this moment, I'm haunted by the words of James Baldwin, who said, "Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, our human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives and imprison ourselves in totems and taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, and nations in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have." He says, "It seems to me that one ought to rejoice in the fact of death, ought to decide indeed to earn one's death by confronting with passion all the conundrums of life. We are responsible to life. It is the small beacon in that terrifying darkness from which we come and to which we will return. We must negotiate this passage in life as nobly as possible for the sake of those who are coming after us." But white Americans, Baldwin continued, do not believe in death. And that is why the darkness of my skin, he said, intimidates them so much. I'm haunted by this quote for a multitude of reasons. Primarily, I'm struggling to try and understand why we are so willing to sacrifice all the beauty of our lives and imprison ourselves in order to deny the fact of death. As a white pastor, I'm desperate to understand what Baldwin meant when he wrote, "White Americans do not believe in death." In what ways do white people deny the reality of death? And how is our denial of death related to our participation in the oppression of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color? Baldwin's words here are reminiscent of the white anthropologist Ernest Becker, whose book, The Denial of Death, won the Pulitzer Prize just 2 months before he died of cancer. Becker advanced the theory that fear and denial of the reality of death is humanity's central driving force, underlying the development of civilization and all human achievement. According to Becker, humans are unique among animals in our awareness of our own mortality. And this awareness leads us to construct value systems which we use to deny our finitude. And Becker suggested that these systems are all endeavors to obtain some kind of immortality, and his work spawned a whole field of research in the psychology of death. Research in this field has demonstrated that our fear of death increases our desire to have children, our desire for fame and notoriety, and our desire to do things like have stars named after us. We're desperate to live on in some way through our offspring, through other people's memories of us. But the research has also shown that the fear of death often leads to us becoming more nationalistic and xenophobic, homophobic, racist, and prejudiced about people who are different from us. Confronted with our own mortality, we tend to dig in our heels, unite around a common enemy, and defend our communities over and against others. We react this way because it is not just our own deaths that we fear. We also fear the death of the things that we've come to love. Our culture, our way of life, our history, our heritage, our monuments and statues, our organizations and our institutions. In some deep way, we know that, as the author of Ecclesiastes said, everything in this life eventually passes away at some point, and yet we stubbornly cling to the familiar and the comfortable because we are terribly afraid of change and often unwilling to let things die even when it has become obvious that their time has come. Sadly, our desperate need to preserve our ideas and institution often leads us to a kind of violence. In the book White Lies, Christopher Driscoll claims that the reason white religion in America has been a miserable failure is that it has refused to learn how to die. And our inability to learn how to die well has been death-dealing for us all, but for some more than others. When faced with radical contingency and the reality of our death, white religion often uses the concept of race to localize our fears on certain populations of people. Instead of learning to accept our limitations and finitude and rely on each other in solidarity with all humanity, white religion attempts to escape the terror of our contingency by projecting our fears onto other people, onto a scapegoat, and to blame them for all of our problems in order to ignore the reality of our limitation and death. Our inability to learn how to accept our limitations, to face our finitude, and to die leads us to prioritize our lives over the lives of others, to create hierarchies and false systems of supremacy which elevate our security above others and make us willing to sacrifice entire communities of people so that we can preserve our ability to live in denial of the reality of death. And then there's Jesus, who comes to us and steps into our fear and our denial and calls us first and foremost to die. As Bonhoeffer proclaimed during the reign of the Third Reich, when Christ calls a person, he bids them to come and die. Death is the first thing every follower of Jesus is called to face. Our baptism is a sign of our acceptance of death. Paul said in baptism we are buried with Christ in death so that as Christ was raised, we too may walk in the newness of life. So our renewal, our reconciliation, our redemption, and our resurrection requires our death first. In our text from Matthew 10 today, Jesus said, "Whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." The entirety of the Christian journey begins first and foremost with an act of dying. And walking in faith throughout our lives demands not only baptism at the beginning, but a constant and unceasing willingness to die and die again and again in order to be reborn and remade in the likeness of the one who we follow. A disciple is not above their teacher. The quintessential action Jesus took in his life over and over again was to refuse to deny the reality of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, in order to be his followers and become like our teacher, we too must learn how to refuse to deny the reality of death, to refuse, in Baldwin's words, to sacrifice all the beauty of our lives and the lives of others and imprison ourselves in order to deny the reality of death. The fact of death is the first fact we face when we're called to follow Jesus. And if we're unwilling to face the fact of our death, then we're simply unwilling to follow Jesus. Period. End of sentence. Following Jesus requires taking up the cross, facing the reality of death so that we can earn our deaths by passionately confronting the conundrums of life. Oh, it's much easier to spiritualize Jesus' call to come and die than it is to face our death. In fear, we said, hey, he couldn't have been talking about literal death. That'd be crazy. It must be spiritual or psychological death that we are called to. Dying to our false selves, you say, dying to sin and selfishness, dying to hate and evil, dying to our attachment of worldly things. It must mean those things. But Jesus didn't die a spiritual death on a spiritual cross. He was executed by the state. The cross was a punitive political practice employed by the Roman Empire that was intended to inflict pain, humiliation, condemnation, torture, and death on a certain segment of the population. Crucifixions took place in public spaces to deter non-compliant behavior. It was an extremely cruel means of death that was only reserved for people who were not citizens, people who the state had deemed to be criminals. As scholar Warren Carter demonstrates, the cross was a violent tool of the state used to divide citizen from non-citizen. Roman citizens could not be crucified. Only people who were deemed revolutionaries, insurrectionists, and foreigners, non-citizens, could be sent to the cross. It was the ultimate tool, then, the government used to maintain the hierarchy of Roman supremacy by means of exclusion, fear, violence, and social control. But we, in our religious capacity, have turned the cross into a sentimental symbol of our supposed conversion. A ticket through the pearly gates into heaven. When we sang the lyrics to those wonderful old Baptist hymns about the cross, we let sentimentality cause us to forget what it truly was. When I survey the wondrous cross, I'll cling to the old rugged cross, lift high the cross. Jesus, keep me near the cross. Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling. In the cross, be my glory ever, till my ransomed soul shall find rest beyond the river, the cross. We sang these songs so sweetly, so kindly over the years in a trenchant denial of the reality of death that we lost the true meaning of the cross and of our faith. In his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, the late James Cone claimed, during the course of 2,000 years of Christian history, our symbol, the cross of salvation, has been detached from any reference to the ongoing suffering and oppression of human beings. The cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament Christians wear around their necks. And then rather than reminding us of the cost of discipleship, it has become a form of cheap grace, an easy way to salvation that doesn't force us to confront the power of Christ's message and mission. Then he said, until we can see the cross and the lynching tree of American apartheid together, until we can identify Christ with the crucified black body hanging from a tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. We must recover the true meaning of the cross. And far be it for me to differ with the great Dr. Cone, but lynching was a form of vigilante mob violence and extra-legal punishment sanctioned and executed by the community, whereas crucifixion was a legal state-sponsored form of punishment executed by the emissaries of the state. Roman governors decided this fate. Roman soldiers who were like the police administered the execution of Jesus. So the praxis of crucifixion was actually much more like an ancient form of toxic policing. If the cross was a sanctioned death reserved for criminals and non-citizens, then it is just like death by police officer in America, has become a state-sanctioned death reserved for black and brown people who our society has deemed as criminals and second-class citizens. Do you see the comparison? Ava DuVernay's powerful documentary, 13th, clearly shows the way we have systematically criminalized black people, from the black codes of Reconstruction to the laws of Jim and Jane Crow to the war on drugs, all the way up until today. It has been a bipartisan process. And there were no Roman citizens being crucified on crosses, just as we don't see very many white citizens in America being crucified by police. What happened to Jesus was less like a lynching by a mob and more like a white police officer with a knee on his neck. More like George Floyd. This is the true scandal of the cross. And we should be scandalized by it, by something so terrible and so horrifying and so heart-wrenchingly powerful. It must always be a scandal to us, because the cross is a paradoxical symbol that represents both death and the promise of redemption, judgment and the offer of mercy, suffering and the power of hope, the worst of human beings, and at the same time an unquenchable thirst for life that refuses to let the worst determine our final meaning and outcome. The cross is an image of horrific state-sanctioned violence and death, and yet, ironically, it also signifies the limits of human violence, the limits of the empire and its power. The empire did the worst it could do in crucifying Jesus. It brought everything to bear that it could, and yet God conquered the cross. God raised Jesus from the dead, thwarting the empire's harshest efforts. And so the cross also reveals to us that in all its might, Rome and America and violence are not as powerful as the God of justice, love, and peace. When he told us that we do not need to be afraid, Jesus was talking about the state-sanctioned violence of Rome. He counseled us, do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. And then he called us to take up the cross, which was a call to choose a particular way of life in which we identify with the nobodies and the foreigners, like slaves and outcasts, and those who have been understood to be cursed by God, the wretched and crucified peoples of the earth, to identify with a sign of the empire's violent and humiliating attempts to dispose of those who were deemed non-essential, unworthy, or those threatened and challenging of the empire's interests. It is to identify with the poor and the oppressed, the widows and the orphans, the foreigner and the immigrant, the people who were deemed as criminals and non-citizens for no other reason than the color of their skin or the location of their birth or the ethnicity in which they came. As James Cone also said, when American Christians realize that they can meet Jesus only in the crucified bodies in our midst, they will encounter the real scandal of the cross. We can only meet Jesus in the other crucified bodies in our midst, in the bodies of those who are being crucified in our streets with a knee of the state on their necks. Following Jesus means identifying with the oppressed and standing in solidarity with those being crucified. When we do this, we too will find ourselves facing a cross. Rest assured, we will find ourselves facing a cross that cuts through our most deeply held convictions, our most deeply valued relationships with mother and father, parents and children, aunts and uncles, family and friends, colleagues and associates, bosses and business partners, customers and clients. The radicality and the cost of following Jesus makes us afraid. Our fear of death is our biggest obstacle to taking up our cross and following Jesus truly. We want to follow Jesus without losing anyone or anything, and yet losing stuff is exactly what Jesus said would most definitely happen to us if we decided to follow him. And he said it more than once. When I consider what it means to follow Jesus in the world that we live today, I often think of a 26-year-old man named Jonathan Daniels, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, tutored in a white supremacist institution, who became an Episcopal priest. In 1965, Jonathan joined the movement in Selma and marched for voting rights. But after the march, he stayed in Selma and helped provide assistance to those in need. He tutored children, and he cared for the poor, and he worked to register people to vote. And in August, he was one of a number of protesters who picketed white-only businesses and stores. All the protesters were arrested and sent to jail. 6 days later, they were released, and while they were waiting for transportation, Jonathan and two young black women walked to the store to buy a soda. And there they were met by an unpaid deputy standing at the door with a shotgun. He raised that gun and threatened the group, leveled his gun at a 16-year-old black girl. Daniels quickly pushed her aside and caught the full blast of the gun and was killed instantly. And that little black girl that Daniel took a bullet for that day was none other than the legendary civil rights activist Ruby Sales. Upon learning of Jonathan's murder, Martin Luther King said it was one of the most heroic Christian deeds he'd ever heard in his entire life and ministry. As human beings, we can't afford to be afraid. But we can't avoid it either. Fear is natural. And yet Jesus anticipated our fears. He tried to speak into our fear with a trinity of statements about why we cannot allow ourselves to be overcome by fear. The difference between a follower and an admirer of Jesus is not that one feels fear and the other doesn't. The difference is that a follower refuses to be overcome by fear or to be paralyzed by fear, but is willing to speak the truth and do the hard things in spite of how terrifying and costly it might be. 3 times in a row, Jesus said, "Have no fear, do not fear, be not afraid." Why? Why should we not allow ourselves to succumb to fear? Jesus told us, because we are in an apocalyptic moment, and everything that has been hidden for generations is being revealed. Because there is a battle going on that not only endangers the lives of our neighbors, but endangers all of our souls as well. And because Jesus did not say all birds matter. No, he said, as the song goes, God's eye is on the sparrow, on the bird people considered nearly worthless and of insignificant value, the poor bird. God has a preferential options for the sparrows of the world, and we should too. Fear will lose its power when our love for the poor and oppressed becomes so strong it outweighs our fear. That's why Jesus proclaimed, "Have no fear, do not fear, and be not afraid. Take up your cross," he said. Don't worry about your life. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the poor and the oppressed will find it. That's the good news, that we do not have to sacrifice all the beauty of our lives and imprison ourselves in totems and taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, and nations in order to deny the fact of death. Instead, we can earn our deaths by taking up the cross and passionately confronting the conundrums in our world today. And we can negotiate this passage as nobly as possible for the sake of those who are coming after us by giving our lives over to something that is greater than family and tribe and kindred and nation or race. We can lose our lives for the sake of establishing the kingdom of God and building the beloved community of love and justice and peace. We can lose our lives in love for the poor and the oppressed. And we can rest in the truth that perfect love will always, always, always cast out fear. Amen.